10 skills you should build before 35. If you're under 35, what you build right now will either compound for the next 50 years. Nobody tells you this loud enough. The skills you avoid learning in your 20s and early 30s don't just delay you. If you're staring down 35 and wondering if you're behind, don't panic. Just listen. This is exactly for you. Let's clear up a misunderstanding right away. 35 is not some cliff edge where opportunity disappears, where doors slam shut, where life suddenly becomes fixed and unchangeable. That fear, while common, isn't actually accurate. People build extraordinary things well past 35, well past 50, well past any arbitrary age someone might use to measure themselves against. But there is something real happening around this age range, something worth taking seriously, and it has nothing to do with opportunity disappearing. It has to do with compounding. And compounding is a far more important concept to understand than most people ever take the time to examine. Think about what compounding actually means. A skill, once built, doesn't simply sit still at the level it was acquired. It continues to grow, deepen, and multiply in value the longer it's actively used and refined. A communication skill developed at 25 gets applied, tested, and sharpened across the following decades. In relationships, in career opportunities, in negotiations, in leadership moments that wouldn't have been possible without that early foundation. Each year that skill is used adds another layer of value on top of what was already there, the same way interest compounds on money left to grow undisturbed over time. This is exactly why the timing of when a skill gets built matters so much more than most people realize. It's not simply about acquiring the skill. It's about how many years that skill has left to compound once it's acquired. Now, compare this to the exact same skill, built for the first time at 50 instead of 25. The skill itself might be identical in quality. The person might even learn it faster, given more life experience and context to draw from. But the runway remaining for that skill to compound is dramatically shorter. 25 years of compounding produces an entirely different outcome than 5 or 10 years of compounding, even starting from the exact same skill level. This isn't a judgment on anyone who builds skills later in life. It's simply an honest acknowledgement of how time functions as a multiplier, regardless of when someone chooses to engage with it. This is precisely why the years before 35 carry a particular kind of weight that later years, however valuable in their own right, simply cannot replicate. It's not that these years are inherently more important as years. It's that whatever gets built during them has more time left to work in your favor, more decades left to accumulate value, more opportunities left to be tested, refined, and compounded upon. A financial habit built at 28 has several more decades to benefit from compound interest than the same habit built at 50. A relationship-building skill developed early has several more decades to generate connections, opportunities, and trust than the same skill developed later. The skill itself might be equally valuable in both cases. The compounding available to it is not. This is why waiting to build important skills, simply because there's no immediate pressure forcing the issue, carries a hidden cost that rarely shows up until much later. The cost isn't visible in the moment of delay. Nothing dramatic happens the day someone decides to postpone building a skill they know they eventually need. But that decision quietly removes years of potential compounding that can never actually be recovered later, no matter how much effort gets applied afterward. This is the real, tangible cost of delay. Not that the opportunity disappears entirely, but that the multiplier working in your favor shrinks with every year the decision gets postponed. So understanding 35 as a compounding cutoff, rather than some rigid deadline, changes the entire way this conversation should be approached. It's not about panic, and it's not about believing that missing this window means missing everything. It's about recognizing, honestly, that time itself is one of the most valuable ingredients in skill building. And every year spent avoiding a skill you know matters is a year of compounding that will never be available to reclaim, no matter how much urgency eventually gets applied once that year has already passed. Let's talk about something that shifts quietly with age, something most people don't fully notice until they're already past the point where it would have mattered most. The way risk gets absorbed differently depending on when it's taken. This isn't about courage increasing or decreasing with age, and it isn't about capability. It's about something more structural than that. Risk taken earlier in life gets absorbed by time itself, cushioned by the sheer number of years remaining to recover from it. Risk taken later carries a fundamentally different weight, not because the person taking it is any less capable, but because the surrounding circumstances have quietly changed in ways that make recovery far more difficult. Think about what it actually means to fail at something in your 20s or early 30s. A failed business venture during these years is painful, certainly. It can feel devastating in the moment, embarrassing, financially costly. But underneath that pain, there's usually still an enormous amount of runway left to recover. There are still decades of career ahead to rebuild reputation, decades of earning potential ahead to recover financially, decades of relationships and opportunities still forming that haven't yet been shaped by this particular setback. The failure gets absorbed into a much larger remaining timeline, and over enough years, it often becomes little more than a formative chapter in a much longer story, rather than a defining conclusion to it. Now consider that same exact failure occurring 20 years later, in someone's 50s rather than their 20s. The pain is often identical in the moment, but the surrounding circumstances have shifted considerably. There's typically far less remaining runway to rebuild financially. There are often more people depending on that person's stability, children, aging parents, established responsibilities that didn't exist during the earlier years. The margin for recovery has narrowed considerably, not because the person has become less capable, but because time itself has quietly removed much of the cushion that once made recovery relatively straightforward. This is exactly why early risk-taking deserves far more encouragement than it typically receives, and why so many people who avoided risk during these formative years later express regret about opportunities they let pass without ever attempting them. The regret rarely centers on having tried and failed. It almost always centers on never having tried at all, precisely because the risk felt too uncertain at a time when, in retrospect, it was actually one of the safest possible windows to take it. The 20s and early 30s don't eliminate risk, but they do provide a uniquely forgiving environment for absorbing whatever consequences that risk might produce. An environment that gradually becomes less forgiving with each passing decade. This isn't meant to suggest that risk should be taken recklessly, without thought or preparation, simply because youth provides some cushion. Thoughtless risk carries real consequences at any age. But calculated risk, the kind involving genuine effort towards something meaningful, with a real possibility of failure attached to it, deserves serious consideration precisely during these years, because the cost of that failure, should it occur, remains genuinely manageable in a way it may not remain manageable later. This is also why comparing risk tolerance across different life stages, without accounting for this shifting cushion, leads to flawed conclusions. It's easy to look at someone taking a bold risk in their 50s and assume similar boldness was always available to them. But the same action, attempted decades earlier, would have carried a completely different risk profile, precisely because more time remained to absorb whatever outcome resulted from it. This is why the encouragement to take meaningful risks early isn't simply motivational language. It reflects an honest, structural reality about how time functions as a safety net, one that gradually narrows with each passing year, regardless of how capable or prepared someone eventually becomes. So if there's a meaningful risk worth considering, a venture worth attempting, a bold decision worth making, and the primary hesitation is simply fear of failure rather than genuine impracticality, it's worth remembering that this fear will likely never feel more affordable to overcome than it does right now, while time itself is still working generously in favor of recovery, however that risk happens to unfold. Let's finish with a truth that deserves far more honest attention than it typically receives. The idea that skipping something simply leaves an empty, neutral space, waiting patiently until you're ready to eventually address it. This feels intuitively true, and it's part of why procrastination and avoidance feel so harmless in the moment. If nothing gets built, the assumption goes, then nothing has really been lost. The space remains open, available, unchanged, ready for whenever you finally decide to fill it. But this assumption is wrong, and understanding why it's wrong reveals something important about what actually happens when meaningful skill building gets consistently postponed. Unbuilt skill doesn't create a neutral gap. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums, whether in physics or in personal development, rarely remain empty for long. Something inevitably moves in to fill that space, and what moves in is almost never neutral either. It's usually frustration, watching others accomplish what could have been accomplished if the skill had been built earlier. It's comparison, measuring your own unrealized potential against someone else's realized version of it. Feeling the gap widen with each passing year, the skill remains unbuilt. And eventually, if the pattern continues long enough, it becomes regret. Quiet, persistent regret about time that has already passed and cannot be reclaimed, regardless of how much motivation eventually shows up afterward. This is precisely why skill building deserves urgency, even when there's no immediate external pressure forcing the issue. It's easy to convince yourself that skipping a particular skill today carries no real cost, simply because nothing dramatic happens in the immediate aftermath of that decision. Life continues normally, nothing collapses. The absence of the skill doesn't announce itself loudly in the short term, but that absence is quietly accumulating in the background, compounding in the opposite direction of growth, until enough time has passed that the gap becomes difficult to ignore. And by then, the emotional cost of that gap has often grown considerably larger than the original discomfort of simply building the skill would have been. Consider how this plays out practically. Someone avoids developing financial literacy for years, telling themselves there will be time later to learn it properly. In the short term, nothing dramatic happens. Bills get paid, life continues. But years later, watching others build genuine financial security through knowledge and habits that could have been developed at any point, the absence of that skill no longer feels neutral. It feels like a source of real frustration, real comparison, sometimes genuine regret about how much easier the current situation might have been had that skill been prioritized earlier. The gap wasn't harmless the entire time it sat unaddressed. It was simply quiet, patiently accumulating consequences that eventually became impossible to ignore. This same pattern applies to nearly every skill worth building. The communication skill left undeveloped doesn't simply remain a neutral absence. It becomes a source of frustration every time an opportunity is lost because the right words couldn't be found under pressure. The physical discipline left unbuilt doesn't remain neutral either. It becomes a source of regret every time declining health limits what could have otherwise been possible. In every case, what wasn't built doesn't wait patiently in some blank, harmless space. It transforms, gradually but consistently, into something considerably heavier to carry. This is why the discipline required to build meaningful skills, especially during years when there's no obvious urgency forcing the decision, matters more than it initially appears to. The absence of pressure today doesn't mean the absence of consequence tomorrow. It simply means the consequence hasn't fully revealed itself yet, patiently waiting somewhere further down the timeline, ready to arrive exactly when it's least convenient to address. So the real question worth asking isn't whether skipping a particular skill feels costly right now, in this immediate moment. It rarely does. The question worth asking is what that unbuilt skill will likely be replaced by several years from now, once the window for building it easily has quietly narrowed. Because nothing valuable simply waits in neutral, empty space forever. Eventually, something fills that space, and far too often, what fills it is exactly the kind of quiet regret that could have been avoided entirely had the decision to build been made years earlier, while the opportunity to do so still felt easy enough to take seriously. If you've ever felt behind, wondering if it's already too late to build the life you want, if turning 35 feels like a countdown instead of a milestone, comment "still time" right now so I know you're ready to start building instead of worrying. Because the next 5 skills are the ones that quietly separate who thrives later from who doesn't.